And this guy who went to another world and instead of receiving an overwhelming power, he received a useless one and was even kicked out of his own home by his father. But he made a comeback and built the most monstrous empire in the world. So grab your egg toast because today you're going to laugh a lot. The episode starts with the guy waking up in another world, and when he gets up, he runs to the window, and when he looks outside, he's amazed. And out of nowhere, the little maid screams, calling for him, saying it was dangerous to stand by the window, and he apologizes. This is Van, but she's impressed by his fancy adult vocabulary and asks where he learned such difficult words. This is Till, his personal maid. Cut to Van being fed because he's incapable of eating by himself. And this makes Van very happy, saying it's the first time he's been surrounded by girls. But Van's father asks what he would do today. And Van, to everyone's surprise, says he would learn about the culture of that world. And this makes the old man burst out laughing and says he was very promising and had high expectations for him. And it seems that whoever is born in this world must know how to use the 4 elemental magics, and whoever is born without aptitude is considered shameful. Cut to Van asking Till about the races of this world, and she says there are elves, fairies, etc. But an old man appears and throws some heavy books on the table. This is Espada, Van's father's butler, who is dying to give the kid a hard time. Weeks pass, and Van is going full Batman mode. Studying is becoming a nightmare in his life. 2 years later, Till was training sword fighting with Van, who was trying to hit the maid, but kept missing, until he gets mad and starts chasing her, but is reprimanded by the other servants, who said it was up to Van to punish the girl, and he gets close to her and flicks her forehead. How wild! And when he turned 5, he was already beating other kids, until the vice commander of the Knights came to say he would be responsible for Van's training. This is D, but he's shocked that Van had no calluses on his hands, and because he studies a lot and doesn't train. But D says that Espada makes him study 3 times more than necessary, and Van didn't even know this. He thought he wasn't the only one studying until his brain melted, and D says he's going to train him to follow the path of swordsmanship. But this guy is crazy, and even with all the craziness, he was having fun. Until the next day, Van was walking through the market when he sees a man dragging a boy and asks what he was doing. But the old man was going to sell his own son to buy dinner. And when the market owner appears and says the slave was worth almost nothing, the old man starts beating the boy. But Van decides to buy the boy and asks what his name was. This is Kami-sen. And the market owner says she would make the pact for him and says he would be his friend and walks off pulling Kami-sen. And sometime later, Kami-sen came to Van's room to say that Crazy D was after him. But Van tells Kami-sen to say he wasn't there in exchange for a cookie. And Van asks where Kami-sen's gloves were, who says he wouldn't need them because he wanted to show the pact mark with him, but changes his mind when Van complains. And D was after Van at all costs. And Kami-sen says Van wasn't there. But D says he had sold himself out for a cookie and says if Van won't train, Kami-sen will go in his place. And since Van turned 8, he could take the magic aptitude test, and surely he would have all 4 magic elements. Nope, he doesn't. And this made his father furious, saying that wasn't magic. How could he protect anyone with that? Unlike his brothers and father, he has magic to create things, and his father already drew his dagger and was about to send him to meet Odin when his brother steps in and says there was a village far from there, and it stood in front of enemy territory. He could send him there, where he would be the lord of those lands. And his father leaves huffing, while his brother says he wouldn't mind if he hated him. But Van holds no grudge and says everything was fine. But this left Till furious, saying he is the most intelligent in the kingdom and still got banished. And Till says she was his personal maid and would go wherever he went. That I already expected, but the big guy there, not so much. D says he'll accompany him on his journey and says he will train him to be the best swordsman. And that's not even the tip of the iceberg. Espada is also going with him, retiring to follow the path with his lord. And it was supposed to be a silent farewell, but out of nowhere it becomes a departure that everyone found out about, and that was D's fault for making this whole mess. Episode 2. On the way, Van decides to test his abilities a little, but it seems there was still a lot of room for improvement. And Van says if Kami-sen gets tired, he can leave. But Kami-sen says he loves Van, he adores the kid, but suddenly the carriage stops, and Van asks what was happening. The knight says that village was under attack, and D says he would drive them out, but Van's father hired some adventurers for his escort, and they said they were only paid to escort, not to fight, and they're in this stalemate, until Van says he would be used as bait, and Till already goes crazy, and says she would be the bait in his place. Seeing this, the adventurers remember him being kind. Nobles tend to be snobby and rude, but Van wasn't like that, and so they decide to help. Even Espada volunteers to get these raiders out of the village, and until that moment, Espada was just an old man, but he's an old man who masters the 4 elements, and already launches an earth magic creating a huge stone wall, giving chance for the archers to shoot at the thieves. D comes in with fury, taking out half the bandits. Seeing that Van's group was demolishing them, their leader runs behind the wall, where the mage was, and Van already appears going for it, attacking the leader's weak point, while Kami-sen comes from above hitting the guy, putting him to sleep permanently.
And finally, they captured the bandits, and the adventurer saw how Van, even as a child, was brave, and then tells his group that he would stay in Van's village. And Till comes full force at Van, saying that next time he should use her life instead of his. She really loves the kid a lot. And with that, they enter the village, and it really is just a tiny village. There's barely anyone there. The village leader comes to ask who they were, and Van says he was the new lord of those lands, and says he would turn that place into a nation, but the guys don't believe in him. And as a precaution, Van orders Espada to build a stone wall to prevent other invaders, and the knights will set traps so bandits don't surround the village again. Far from there, Van tested his abilities again. Concentrating, he builds a cube, which can transform into many things, making the other two there wonder what that was. And walking through the forest, the adventurer sees Van and is shocked by the amount of cubes he created, and asks if he could try to cut that thing. And when he swings his sword at the material, it flies, breaking a tree, surprising all of them. Later, Van continued creating more and more things with his magic, and Till asks if he doesn't get tired from creating so much, but he doesn't even feel his mana draining, and then creates a katana, which leaves Kami-san hungry to test when Van gives it to him, and he gets so happy that he'll keep it as a family treasure. And on the other hand, Till also wanted some things, and Van gives her a gift, but it seems it doesn't quite suit her. And at night they slept, but Van was thinking how he could build a house, and the next day he makes a bunch of blocks and starts stacking them all, and asks the village chief if they could build a house right there. And the old man says that would be a good area, since they don't even have that many houses. Van concentrates, using his mana with all his strength. He finally builds his house, and when they see that, everyone is impressed. Van built an enormous house, and the village residents ask him to build houses for them too.
Van says that if they delivered the necessary materials, he would build a house for everyone. And the knights already get into a rivalry with the adventurers. And in just a few minutes, he builds many houses, which leaves him tired, and nothing better than a good bath. Till decides to call Van to take a bath with her, and the adventurer girl steps in saying she wanted to as well. And Van gets shy and says he would bathe alone. In the bath, Van comments that Kami-san was more muscular, and until this point, I thought Kami-san was a girl. How about that? And Kami-san says he would get like D. And speaking of the devil, the guy appears, bringing his enormous sword. And thanks to the knights, they have defenses. And Van says it would be better to have a water well. And quickly, Espada starts opening the way for the water, while D and his men leveled the path for the water to flow better. And at the end of the day, D still had energy, unlike his soldiers, who were completely spent. Van says it would be better to stop there. And the next day, they continued, and finally the people would have a well, so they wouldn't have to keep going to the lake for water. And this makes the village elder happy, who thanks Van. And so cut to a carriage bringing a noble and her knight, who calms her princess who seemed tense, and says that when they arrived where Van was, everything would be fine. And finally, walls. Van builds strong walls that will prevent bandits from entering, and if that happens, they will get a mouthful of lead. D comments that if Van's father hadn't kicked him out, he could have used his son's powers to improve his kingdom. And this makes Espada furious, saying that the Marquis valued the strength of the kingdom. But let's admit, this guy is very strong. Even without using a sword, the guy can build walls and weapons. And at lunch, Van said his magic had limits, that he could only build things he had seen before. And with the village growing, soon he could plant. But Espada says they didn't have ingredients for Van's beloved baked sweets. And the kid panics, saying they should think of something to make money so he could eat his beloved sweets. And Kami-san suggests he sell the blocks he makes, but only he could manipulate them. Till says she could hunt monsters, but only adventurers can hunt monsters. And the chubby guy there says they should test their weapons, but neither Kami-san nor Till feels like using them, until Van convinces Kami-san and sends him to test the chubby guy's sword and shield, which is made of orc skin. Kami-san, afraid of chipping the sword, just barely taps the shield, which splits in half, leaving the chubby guy in tears. And at that point, another adventurer arrives and asked if he wanted to buy minerals, which were collected from the mountains. Van decides to test the mineral, transforming it into a cube, and the chubby guy asks him to build an awesome sword for him. But this leaves everyone hungry for a weapon, and Espada appears and sees the minerals, where he's surprised that those were rare metals, and they're only found in dungeons. And if there are some nearby, there will be lots of merchants coming in and out of the village, and that would make Van rich. But if that happens, other countries and nations will come in full force, and they decide to announce the dungeons when Van's territory expands. Walking for the village, Van and Till receive some news, with a guy coming to warn that there were highly powerful armored dragons heading toward the village. EP4. The lizards are already coming at full speed, and to stop them, D orders them to shoot, but he's surprised when he sees that the ballista made by Van managed to pierce the skull of one of the armored ones.
but the arrows were running out, and Dee, not knowing what to do, listens to Van, who said to shoot with the wooden arrows, and so he does, but is surprised by the result. The arrows pierced all the lizard's armor. Even the heaviest plating was no match for the weapons. After a while, the village people dismantled the lizards, when Van comes to congratulate the knights, but sees there was a lot of meat, and has the brilliant idea of using the meat in a festival. But a problem came up. If they sell that meat, they could earn some money, but they would still have to pay taxes, and that would be bad, because then they would see that those lands were profitable. And then Espada gives Van an idea, where he sends a letter to his brother, telling him to accept the credit for defeating the armored lizards. When the next day, some merchants arrived at the village, and Van receives them with great joy, because finally he'll make some money. And when they see Van, they're surprised, as they know whose son he is. Van shows them the place where they're storing some hides, and this shocks the merchants, that a small village managed to defeat so many monsters. Van asks if they can buy his weapons too, and says they could take the meat for free. They say they could pay well for the swords, but soon Van realized they wanted to keep the weapons advertising exclusively to themselves, and Van recommends they open a shop right there in that village. And when they see Van built the shop in seconds, they almost have a heart attack. And meanwhile, at the front gate, that princess and her bodyguard. And the knight came to alert Van, who quickly runs to the location and introduces himself as the lord of the village. The knight is called Panamera, and look at the hood of this car. It's very beautiful. And this little girl is Alte, the princess of the kingdom of Yaranet. Van already sees through the knight's masks and says they came to see if the lord of the lands was an enemy, since it's at the border of the Yaranet kingdom. Van says he was kicked out of his home, but Panamera says that was a lie, because he had a wall so he should have 5,000 men with him. And Van starts cracking up, and says he would show how he did it, and takes them both outside, and orders an earth wall to be raised, and with that he transforms it into a wall. And finally, Panamera relaxes, and says she was against Alte's marriage, and then says if she married him she was fine with it. Van doesn't understand anything. At this age he already has a maid and even a wife. And Alte gets shy, and says she doesn't like him, but relax, soon enough you'll give in. Panamera says they would spend the night there, and Alte could stay as a guest at Van's house to heat up the atmosphere. At dinner, Van asks the girl what she liked, and she says she liked cute things, and he gets interested and says he wanted to see the cute things she liked, and Till and Camison already stick their noses where they weren't invited, saying they wanted to see too. At night she walked with Van. She says she was relieved she didn't have to marry him, and at this age he already got rejected by the princess. Back to Panamera's room, we have the beautiful view of the rear of this beautiful car, and the knight asked if Alte had already confessed, but the girl gets embarrassed, but I think she's starting to fall in love.
The next day, Van wakes up to Till and Camison screaming. They came to warn that something was happening at the lake, and Van runs straight to the location. When he gets there, everyone was surrounding the lake, and there was a mermaid staring them down, like something out of a horror movie. That was a half fish, and Van shouts to her, asking if she needed help, but she ignored the guy, and Van has the brilliant idea of offering meat, and sends Camison and Till to bring some. The mermaid gets very close and starts eating, but she gets surprised and asks what kind of meat that was, and Van says lizard meat, and she asks who defeated the lizards. And Van's fans decide to say it was him, and so she leaves, but what they didn't expect was that she would bring more people. That's why you don't feed the animals. And their king comes to speak with Van, saying he would accept marriage with his daughter. And Van almost has a meltdown, but a problem has landed on his plate. The Fish King says the lizards inhabited the lake and destroyed their lands, and since Van put an end to them, he would offer his daughter so he would protect his people. But Van says he didn't need that, he would protect his people, and says he built a place for the fish to stay. And this surprises the king. Van asks the fish for a favor. They had built a pipeline, but hadn't managed to open it, so they sent the merman to do the job. The king says he could leave the sewage treatment to them, and at that Panamera arrives and sees the fish, and the king calls Van his son-in-law, which leaves the girls indignant. And that little friend there calls Van her husband, making the situation even more confusing. And the next day, Van and Alte were strolling together, and she apologizes for having misunderstood the situation, but who shows up is Alte with her friends. And they start rocking the boat, making Alte fall on top of Van, who says the mermaid princess isn't his wife. And she gets really mad and leaves. The next day, her father came to check the situation and says he was with his daughter, but she was in love with another woman. And she gets shy. So the king says they would hold a competition. If they win, he would approve the marriage. And then Dee appears, saying he would fight for him, and as expected, everyone starts stepping up, saying they wanted him to win. They would compete best of 3, and Van gives the idea for the first competition, water volleyball. And who's going to play is Panamera, who's in a nice bikini, and Till. And the game begins. These guys never played volleyball and already became better than Carasano. But they were losing badly, and Panamera gives Till that great motivational boost, and she doesn't want to lose. And they score the point, and it goes like that until the king is at the net for the attack when Panamera appears and blocks, but he breaks through her block and scores the winning point.
And now the next game will be intense, being swimming. It will be a relay. Who will fight for Van's honor will be Kamasan and Dee. And so the competition begins. The mermaid princess already takes the lead, while Kamasan is behind. And with all his strength, he goes all out and catches up to the mermaid. But she still advances, and her relay partner already jumps and goes all out, taking the lead. But it doesn't end there. When Kamasan arrives, Dee advances with everything, starting with the butterfly stroke, and Van is impressed with Dee's speed, who wins the competition in seconds. But it seems Dee left something behind. How embarrassing. And the last competition will be snow cone eating. It will be Alte and Van. And whoever finishes faster will be the winner. And so the competition begins, with them eating the snow cone, but the snow cone freezes their heads. The king is solid at this thing and goes all out. They can't lose to the fish. Van, seeing that Alte was struggling, decides to kick it into high gear and eats at an inexplicable speed. And finally they finish, and Van and his beloved Alte win the competition. But the king comes to say he liked him even more and says for him to take good care of his daughter. Winning didn't even make sense then. But Van falls to the ground, feeling sick from eating too much snow cone, and Till panics and runs to help. Panamera comes to congratulate Alte, who had never had so much fun, and tells her story that she never had friends. And when she was young, she discovered her puppet magic, but what happened was that her own mother cursed her for having such a horrible power. Whoever had that type of magic was considered evil. And in the end, when she turned 10, her father sent her to go marry the Lord of the Lands, and she found Van, who was also like her, rejected. And she began to be her friend. But in the forest, the adventurers were in trouble, and you'll find out why soon. EP 6. Van was showing his construction to Alte when Panamera arrives and asks about that ballista, and Van says he increased the firing power and sends Kamasan to test it to see its strength. And the shot came out at an impressive speed. Panamera is impressed and says she wanted to buy one, but Van refuses. And then she says she would do him a favor in exchange for a ballista. And Kamasan says it would be better for her to have at least 2 or more ballista arrows, and shows her why. He splits Panamera's sword in seconds, so clean you can barely see the cut. And she tells Van to give her some arrows when they hear a scream from the forest. It's the adventurers who tell them to run, and there's no time. An enormous dragon emerges from the forest. And quickly Panamera takes charge of the situation and tells Van to take Alte inside the walls. And the girls seemed to be scared, and Van reassured her, saying they now had the ballistas. Van orders the knights to stand ready. The dragon is a problem for the village, and there's always got to be one who stays behind to cause trouble. And when the guy was about to become dragon food, the chubby guy throws a dagger at the colossus, catching the lizard's attention. But soon the chubby guy will be eaten if they don't do anything, and Van orders them to shoot, but the arrows aren't hitting the dragon. And then Panamera says she'll put the monster to sleep with her magic, and summons a fireball and throws it at the dragon, who is hit in the face, falling to the ground. But it seems he's tough and already comes back with everything. Van orders them to shoot again, hitting its wings. They want to bring that thing down. And again, Panamera launches a katan where the dragon dodges, but didn't expect this. She managed to move the katan wherever she wants, hitting the dragon again, who falls, destroying its wings. Panamera leaps from the top of the wall and says she would go into the village to intercept the dragon. Then Espada appears and says he will buy them time, and already raises an earth wall and makes the debris bury the dragon. But the problem is that Espada is slow. And Kamasan tells Man to go back and take care of the defense while he would take Espada back. And the dragon already comes out of the rubble furious. Van asks Panamera for a favor to immobilize it with her magic when the time comes, and orders the ballistas to stand ready. And meanwhile Dee appears and says he will face the dragon. But they can't handle the dragon alone. And when they were about to send the knights into the fray, Espada raises an earth wall for them to escape, so Van orders Panamera to throw the fireball at the colossal dragon, leaving it weak. So the ballistas launch their attack against the dragon, leaving it like a pincushion. Dee approaches to see if it was alive, and when he gets close, the beast opens its eye, about to attack Dee, who just delivers the finishing blow to the dragon. And finally victory. And with that, Van congratulates the person who was of great help, Panamera, and her chest practically takes up half the screen. And the knight says she will officially forge an alliance with Van, so that he has help when needed. It would be a great help to have a large kingdom as an ally. EP 7. Sometime later, the merchants brought more merchants to take a look at the dragon they defeated, which should be worth a lot of money. But the old merchants come trying to lowball Van. They wanted to pay 60 platinum coins, but this dragon must be worth more. The old merchants start fighting with the brothers and say they will be fired for causing problems for the market. And Van gets worried about their situation and says they could open their own market. That would be a good idea. But for that, you must have 3 things: merchant guild membership fee, a physical store, and a recommendation from a noble with a title. And Van goes to speak with Panamera, who agrees, but says if he doesn't stand out, sooner or later they would investigate and trace it back to him. That hit Van right in the heart. But Panamera says there was a way to solve it. He just had to earn a noble title. But he gets nervous that he could attract too much attention, but she tells him to relax, that receiving the title of Dragon Slayer at 8 wouldn't be bad.
just like her, who received a title young, and many enemies appeared, but she barbecued every single one of them. She will help for now. And the merchant brothers were happy and thanked Van and asked him to sell the dragon to them for 130 platinum coins. There's just one problem. There's no carriage to carry the dragon because the old merchants took them all. But Van has an idea. He says he would build carriages for them, and Panamera appears and says she will help him, giving some war horses to carry the dragon. And in the middle of the road, the old merchants were laughing because the brothers would be fired, but get surprised when they see Panamera coming in full force and passing right by them. But in the kingdom of Scuderia, Panamera was saying she wanted another person to receive the title of Dragon Slayer, but the king gets angry because she wants to give her title to another person. And the king asks what this person did to deserve the title. He only killed a forest dragon, which is capable of wiping out an entire city. And the king asks if he was a 4-element mage, but not even that. The guy defeated it with only construction magic, and she tells how he became lord of the land. And as proof of the defeat, she brought a fang from the colossal dragon. The king was so impressed that he allowed the title to be given to Van, of Baron. And this surprised everyone, that the Marquis' son earned a title at 8 years old. Van, with his skills, built a tower, and shows how the village is getting big. And at the top of the tower, they were eating, very happily, when Alte says Van should just call her Alte. Oh ho, we're getting somewhere. When Kamasan alerts that there were people at the front gate. But they were just citizens from a distant village, they were looking for help, and came to ask Van, owner of the lands. Van says he would help, and asks how many there were, but there were still many people missing, and Van says he would send someone to fetch them, and would give them houses and jobs. But Van is surprised when the old man says they had cows. That would be great, raising cattle and having milk, so he could finally make his sweets. And who decided to go fetch the rest of the people was the adventurers, who served as their escort. One of the women was worried, saying the village was in ruins, just